Somewhere in your house right now, there is a computer that Microsoft has quietly decided to abandon, and if you own it, you might not even know it yet. On October 14th, 2025, without a press conference, without a keynote, without a single balloon drop, Microsoft pulled the plug on Windows 10, and in doing so, it handed over 500 million machines to a fate the company assumed nobody would question, pay up, buy new hardware, or live dangerously with an unprotected operating system quietly rotting on your desk. That was the plan. Upgrade or expire. But somewhere between the fine print of that end-of-life notice and the millions of people who actually read it, something happened that Microsoft's PR department did not want you to notice. And the tech press, chasing the next AI headline, barely blinked at. People didn't buy new laptops. They didn't pay for extended security updates either. They did something else entirely, something that Windows has spent almost 20 years training people to believe was impossible, laughable, reserved for basement-dwelling programmers who liked typing commands into black screens for fun. They installed Linux, and not in the trickle it's always come in a flood. Zorin OS alone logged over 1 million downloads in the 2 months after that October deadline, and 78% of those downloads came directly from Windows machines, meaning this wasn't curiosity, this was an exit. Global Linux desktop share broke past 4.7% by the end of 2025, a jump of 70% in just 3 years, and by March of 2026, Linux gaming on Steam had climbed to 5.33%, a number that would have gotten you laughed out of a tech forum a decade ago. This is not a story about hobbyists anymore. This is the beginning of the largest operating system migration in modern computing history, and almost nobody's talking about it the way they should be. So let's talk about it, because 5 specific pieces of software, 5 free, unassuming, unglamorous operating systems, are doing something Apple never managed in 40 years of trying. They are making ordinary, non-technical, everyday people walk away from Windows, and they are doing it on purpose. Before we get into who they are, you need to understand why this time is different, because Linux enthusiasts have been shouting, "This is the year," for over 2 decades, and been wrong every single time. The old excuses were real. Drivers didn't work, games didn't run. The interface looked like it was designed by someone who actively resented the concept of a mouse. Those were not small problems. They were the entire reason Linux stayed locked in server rooms and computer science labs while the rest of the world clicked happily through Windows. But somewhere between 2022 and 2026, 3 walls that had stood for 20 years all cracked at the same time. Valve quietly built a compatibility layer called Proton that let thousands of Windows-only games run on Linux, often faster than they ran on Windows itself. Hardware manufacturers, tired of writing drivers for a shrinking pool of Windows versions, started supporting Linux properly for the first time. And a handful of small development teams made a decision that changed everything. They stopped trying to make Linux look like Linux and started building it to feel exactly like the Windows desktop millions of people already knew in their bones. The combination, better technology colliding head-on with a forced migration deadline, is the exact recipe that every failed year of Linux prediction was missing. This time, the door didn't just open. Someone pushed people through it. There's a conversation happening quietly inside the technology industry right now that almost never reaches ordinary viewers, and it goes something like this. For 2 decades, Windows didn't dominate because it was the best possible operating system. It dominated because it was the only realistic option for most people. The lock-in was total and invisible at the same time. Your favorite software only ran on Windows. Your printer driver only existed for Windows. Your Office IT department only supported Windows. Switching away wasn't really a technical decision at all. It was closer to a social one, the kind of decision nobody wants to be the first to make. What has actually changed in the last few years isn't just the software. It's the institutional momentum sitting underneath it. Developers who learned to code on Linux in university are now the senior engineers deciding what technology their companies standardize on. Cloud. Infrastructure that already runs almost entirely on Linux has quietly made Linux fluency a mainstream professional skill instead of a niche curiosity. The Steam Deck alone put a genuine Linux device into the hands of millions of players who never once went looking for Linux on their own. And every one of those quiet, invisible touchpoints adds another thread to an ecosystem that is finally large enough, finally confident enough to stand entirely on its own. Let's start with the name you've probably heard, even if you've never touched a single line of Linux in your life. Linux Mint, the quiet giant that has been the first stop for Windows refugees for almost 10 years running. What makes Mint dangerous to Windows in 2026 isn't that it exists, it's how little effort it now takes to switch. Open Mint for the first time, and your instincts don't even register the change. The taskbar sits at the bottom, exactly where your muscle memory expects it. The Start menu opens from the bottom left. Your File Explorer behaves like a File Explorer is supposed to behave. There is no jarring redesign to memorize, no minimalist philosophy stripping away the buttons you rely on, just a desktop that quietly agrees with everything Windows already taught you. And it comes ready to work the second it boots. Video codecs pre-installed, browser plugins configured, DVD playback built in, none of the maddening scavenger hunt for missing software that used to define the early Linux experience. Built on Ubuntu's rock-solid foundation and maintained by a team obsessed with stability over Flash, Mint is what happens when a piece of software decides its only job is to disappear into the background and simply let you work. Then there's Zorin OS, and if Mint is the gentle on-ramp, Zorin is the operating system built specifically, deliberately, unapologetically for the exact person reading Windows 10's obituary right now. Zorin's entire identity centers on one feature that sounds almost too simple to matter until you actually use it. An appearance panel that lets you flip your entire desktop between a Windows-style layout, a Mac-style layout, and several others with a single click. No configuration files, no terminal commands, no technical fluency required. You click once, and your unfamiliar new operating system suddenly looks like the one you've used your entire adult life. Zorin goes further, quietly running many Windows applications directly inside Linux using wine and bottles under the hood, chipping away at the single biggest reason people stayed loyal to Windows for 2 decades. The software they depended on simply wasn't available anywhere else. It even mirrors your Android phone onto your desktop, sharing files and notifications the way people expect from a modern connected system. When Windows 10's end-of-life hit, Zorin didn't see a bump, it saw a stampede. That is not the behavior of curious tinkerers, that is the behavior of people abandoning ship. Now, not everyone leaving Windows is leaving because their hardware got cut off. A growing, furious segment of users are leaving because of what Windows has become, and that's where Pop! OS enters the story, built by a company called System 76, with a completely different mission than looking familiar. Its mission is being fast, clean, and free of everything that has made Windows feel less like an operating system and more like a product built to serve someone else's business model. Think about everyone who watched Microsoft cram Copilot into Notepad. Of all places, Notepad, a tool for writing plain text that somehow needed artificial intelligence bolted onto it. Think about everyone who read the headlines about Windows recall, a feature that silently screenshotted their entire screen every few seconds and stored it in a database that security researchers found wasn't even properly encrypted. These people are not looking for an operating system that reminds them of Windows. They want the opposite. They want to forget Windows ever happened to their computer. Pop! OS answers that with Cosmic, its own desktop environment that went stable in late 2025, fast in a way that feels almost aggressive after years of bloated Windows updates, and refreshingly honest, no ads buried in the settings menu, no AI assistant offering unsolicited suggestions, no telemetry quietly phoning home without permission. For the user who isn't fleeing a hardware deadline but fleeing a philosophy, Pop! OS is the answer to a question they didn't even know they were allowed to ask. What does a computer look like when the company that built it actually works for you instead of the other way around? The privacy angle deserves more weight than most coverage ever gives it, because it explains why this migration isn't just about people who got priced out. A meaningful slice of the users choosing Linux right now aren't leaving because their hardware failed some arbitrary checklist. They're leaving because of what Windows quietly turned into. The recall scandal, where Microsoft shipped a feature that silently screenshotted the entire screen every few seconds and stored it in a database that turned out not to be properly secured, wasn't just an embarrassing bug report, it was a signal about priorities. Copilot getting forced into Notepad, into Paint, into the taskbar itself wasn't just clutter, it was evidence that the operating system's real customer had quietly shifted from the person sitting at the keyboard to the advertisers and AI divisions standing behind the company. For people who reached that conclusion on their own, Linux stopped being a technical alternative and became something closer to a philosophical one. It's an operating system that does exactly what you tell it, that doesn't quietly phone home with your behavior, and that doesn't inject commercial features into the tool you use to write a grocery list. Consider gaming too, because for years it was the single strongest argument keeping people loyal to Windows, no matter how frustrated they got with everything else about it. PC gaming effectively meant Windows gaming, full stop, and every major release, every competitive multiplayer title was built, tested, and supported on Windows alone. Valve's Proton layer quietly dismantled that argument piece by piece, translating Windows-only games into something Linux could run natively, often with performance that matches or even beats the original Windows version. When the last major excuse falls, and it has fallen, the remaining reasons to stay start looking a lot thinner than they used to. Then there's a name that carries weight in a completely different world, Fedora, and its importance to this story has almost nothing to do with living rooms and everything to do with office buildings. While Mint, Zorin, and Pop! OS are winning over everyday households, Fedora is quietly annexing something far more dangerous to Microsoft's long-term future: developers. Backed by Red Hat, now part of IBM, Fedora ships the newest, sharpest tools in the entire Linux ecosystem before almost anyone else gets them, which matters more than it sounds, because developers who build their daily workflow on Linux don't just use it, they bring it with them into every company they ever work for. Every cloud server humming in a data center somewhere runs on Linux. Every major AI model being trained right now trains on Linux infrastructure. The professional backbone of modern technology has quietly run on Linux for years, and the wall separating that professional world from the ordinary home desktop is crumbling faster than most people realize. And finally, there's the story that might be the strangest and most poetic of the entire migration: a distribution called Elementary OS, built, unbelievably, by a former Microsoft engineer, someone who once sat inside the company, watched its product decisions get made from the inside, and chose to walk away and build the opposite. Its sibling project, Anduin OS, takes that mission somewhere even sharper: a Linux distribution built on Ubuntu and engineered to look and feel exactly like Windows 10, the very version of Windows that hundreds of millions of comfortable, satisfied users were forcibly pushed off of. The taskbar, the start menu, the entire visual language people spent a decade memorizing, rebuilt faithfully with zero data collection, zero background AI, zero telemetry. Its biggest early criticism, that installing software required intimidating terminal commands, quietly disappeared with native FlatHub integration, letting anyone browse and install thousands of applications the same way they'd browse an app store, no typing required. For someone who simply wants their familiar Windows 10 back, minus the forced obsolescence, minus the surveillance, minus the eventual bill, it's an almost eerily precise answer to a problem that felt unsolvable 18 months ago. Zoom out, and the pattern across all 5 of these stops being a coincidence and starts looking like a coordinated wave arriving at exactly the right shore at exactly the right time. Global Linux desktop share climbed 70% between 2022 and 2025. The United States crossed 5% Linux adoption for the very first time in its history in June of 2025. India, astonishingly, hit 16%, the highest rate among major world economies. Analysts project the global Linux market growing from roughly $22 billion in 2024 to nearly $100 billion by 2032. Those are not the numbers of a dying hobbyist project. Those are the numbers of a platform that spent 20 patient years quietly preparing for a moment it knew someday would arrive. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone still betting everything on Windows staying untouchable. None of this happened by accident. Mint spent years perfecting stability nobody noticed until they needed it. Zorin spent years building bridges specifically for people who would one day be standing exactly where you might be standing right now. Pop! OS spent years building an entire desktop from scratch instead of settling for good enough. Fedora spent years earning trust inside the exact rooms where enterprise technology decisions get made. And somewhere inside Microsoft's own walls, someone who understood the company's direction better than most outsiders ever could looked at where it was heading and chose to build the escape hatch himself. None of these projects got lucky. They got ready, patiently, deliberately, for years. For a moment, they couldn't predict the exact date of, but knew eventually was coming. Think about what this actually feels like for an ordinary person right now, not a developer, not an enthusiast, just someone sitting in front of a computer that still boots fast, still opens their browser, still does everything they need it to do. Their hardware didn't fail, their computer didn't break. Microsoft simply decided, on a date it chose, that their perfectly good machine was no longer worth protecting unless they paid for the privilege or bought something new. Picture the retired teacher who bought her laptop in 2019 and never once thought about operating systems until a warning popped up, telling her it was no longer safe to use. Picture the small business owner running 20 aging desktops who did the math and realized replacing every single one wasn't a line item he could quietly absorb. Neither of them set out to become a Linux user. Both simply refused to be told their working computer was worthless. And that refusal, multiplied across millions of households, is what built the wave now crashing over Windows. That's not a technical failure. That's a business decision, dressed up as one. And for the first time in over 20 years, ordinary users have a real door standing open on the other side of that decision, an operating system that runs on the same hardware they already own, often faster and smoother than Windows ever did on it, completely free, with no countdown clock hanging over its future. Application developers will still need to keep building Linux versions of the tools people rely on every day. Hardware manufacturers will still need to keep maintaining that driver support instead of treating it as an afterthought. Corporate IT departments, notoriously slow to move on anything, will still need to add Linux to their official approved lists rather than quietly tolerating it on the side. Some of those shifts are already well underway. Others haven't even started. But none of that changes what's already true today, right now, on the machine sitting in front of you. The 5 distributions covered here didn't stumble into this moment by luck. They spent years quietly getting ready for a deadline nobody could predict, but everyone in that world somehow sensed was eventually coming. And for the ordinary person, staring at an end-of-life notice on a computer that still works perfectly fine, the patience just turned into an open door. Whether this migration becomes the permanent shift that Linux advocates have predicted every single year since the early 2000s still depends on things outside any single distribution's control, whether app developers keep building for it, whether hardware makers keep supporting it, whether corporate IT departments finally stop treating it as an afterthought. Some of those dominoes are already falling. Others are still standing, waiting. But here's what's undeniable. Sitting right in front of us in numbers that don't lie, the software is finally ready. The timing has never been better, and the operating system that spent 2 decades assuming it had nowhere else for its users to go has just discovered, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that it did.